Okay, here comes video number 3 in the Unit 4 playlist on political organization of space, and we're going to be talking about geopolitics. And again, this is basically, again, controlling space and territory. The first real big theorist in this regard was a guy named Frederick Ratzel, a German, who developed what he called the organic theory. And he says that a state is like an organism. It's born, it has a life, and then it dies. And he said states were kind of the same thing. And what does a state need? A state needs certain things in order to survive. And what it needed most of all was space. He also talked about things like resource wealth and population. And obviously, countries with more people were going to be stronger and that kind of thing. But the idea was that the country was like a living, breathing thing, and space was the life giving force of a state. So from Ratzel, we get this German school of geopolitics. The Nazis were big on this, but even long before the Nazis, this idea of the Schlieffen Plan, where the Germans, prior to the First World War, had a plan where they were going to be able to, knock France out because Russia was going to take forever to mobilize. And, they definitely had this idea of controlling space and territory. But Lebensraum was the idea of controlling vast territories. And if you remember in your history classes, Hitler wrote in his book that to the east, that Germany would acquire all of this living space, all right, Lebensraum, living space. So this is where geopolitics really kind of came from. And before we think of this and just discount it as being German and Nazi, the United States has a history of geopolitical, planning in our history. The idea of manifest destiny, that we were somehow destined to rule over a sea to shining sea kind of a state, westward expansion and fighting wars with Mexico and threatening war with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory, and displacing Native Americans, and this expansion of the United States, this elbow room kind of a mentality. That's geopolitics. So then along comes this British American school. And the first of this was Halford Mackinder. Mackinder was a professor at Oxford, and he proposed this idea of a pivot area that he called the heartland. And this becomes known as the heartland theory, that if you control this pivot area of Eastern Europe, the vast, flat, grain growing areas of Eastern Europe and stretching into Russia, if you controlled that heartland, you could command what he called the world island, which was that massive Eurasian land mass. And if you controlled the world island, you could very much control the world. Mackinder predicted that Russia would be the most powerful country. In 1905, Mackinder's theory took a big shot when Russia fought a war with Japan over expansion into the Korean Peninsula. And everybody who thought, anything about military technology and power thought that the Russians would just obliterate Japan. Shockingly, Japan, very organized, very, very well planned out strategy. They defeated the Russians in that war. It was a huge embarrassment for Russia. It hastened the downfall of the Tsar and his government about a decade later, during World War I. And it really announced and signaled that Japan was emerging as a world power. During World War II, of course, the Soviet Union has spread into Eastern Europe and, of course, took over the eastern portion of Germany. And that heartland theory was a big precursor to this idea of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union kind of inherited the power that Mackinder always thought that Russia might be able to possess. So during the Cold War, the heartland theory came back into vogue. Excuse me. So in the United States, a Yale professor kind of came up with a corollary or a rebuttal to this heartland theory by saying it's not so much the heartland that you must control, it's the inner crescent or the rimland around the heartland. And so Spikeman says if you control the rimland, you control Eurasia. And therefore, if you have Eurasia, again, you control that world island. So look at the potential superpowers of today that are based in this rimland around the heartland. China, you have the, Middle East with all of their oil money. You have countries like India that are big emerging countries with populations that are over 1 billion and again, growing economies. So neither of these theories, neither heartland nor rimland, talk about the idea of the United States. And Alfred T. Mahan was a writer, a Navy officer at Annapolis, and he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power on History. And of course, the British Empire was a sea-based empire. Their navy was bigger than any other country in the world. And then the United States was the natural inheritor of this great naval power. President Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s had that great white fleet that he wanted to sail it around the world so that everybody could see the military power and the projection of power of the United States. In today, you certainly see the U.S. Navy as a big projector of power. 70% of the world, as you know, is covered by water. 90% of global trade is taking place on the water. So definitely when you see this rimland theory and the heartland theory, make sure you remember that sea power is still a big part of that as well. So here's the heartland and the rimland in terms of seeing it on a map. That heartland is the area of Eastern Europe stretching into Russia, including the stands. And again, in the rimland, potential superpowers. Certainly China, perhaps India, Middle East with their money derived from very scarce resources like oil, but also don't forget the European Union, the EU. And certainly the EU can be seen as perhaps a threat to Russia, and certainly when you look at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States, Canada, and their European allies. Sometimes you see that Putin in Russia today thinks that NATO and that EU expansion is a direct threat to the economy and the well-being and the viability of Russia as an independent sovereign state. And certainly there's conflict all throughout this heartland rimland. Sometimes the shatter belt theory that you read about, look where conflicts have been. Russia fighting in Ukraine, certainly conflicts in Syria and Iraq, conflicts in India, Pakistan, the wars that were in Korea in the 1950s and in Vietnam in the 1960s. A lot of these areas, of course, are in this shatter belt of the heartland and the rimland where they collide together. So why does geography matter? I mentioned in a previous video that we talk about a multipolar world. Before World War I, there were 7 great powers of Europe. After the World War II, the Earth was pretty much a bipolar tug of war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Are we now entering back into a multipolar world where the United States is merely one superpower, an emerging China, a stronger EU? But what does the EU do after Brexit, when Great Britain leaves? And of course, they keep getting these extensions and delays, and no one can predict for sure what that's ultimately going to look like. But what could that be? Does China continue to strengthen? Does the United States and China, work out our trade disagreements, or does that relationship sour? And again, Russia is still this kind of big wild card. They still have a tremendous stockpile of nuclear weapons, and certainly, Putin is a student of geography. And I found this picture a couple of years ago. And for anybody who kind of understands Putin and knows Putin, it's a little terrifying to think that he looks at a map and that he understands geography and that he really can see the geopolitical realities of geography. And you have to understand, if you're Russia, Russia doesn't have a lot of natural defense. The only big thing about Russia is that it is big. Every time that Russia gets invaded, whether it's by Napoleon or by Hitler, they practice that scorched earth philosophy where they just keep retreating and backing up into the interior of Russia, and they wait for winter time to come. But if you look, the whole western portion of the country is flat. Easy for an invader to get in. There are no real huge mountains that surround Russia to prevent invasions. It's this frozen wasteland of ice to the north. It's this huge kind of warming area of Siberia. It's not as cold and frosty as maybe we think of Siberia being. Climate change has changed this into a much more temperate part of the world. As China's population, continues to grow and this area thaws out, does China view expansion into this resource-rich area? And how would Russia control that. Russia's population is barely 1/10 of China's, and most of that population is centered over here in Western Russia, near the European mainland here, Moscow to St. Petersburg, basically. These Ural Mountains, they split Russia kind of east and west. There's a Western European portion of Russia, and then there's this vast eastern domain that's pretty much empty of Russian people. There's a lot of indigenous people out here, people who don't necessarily identify as being Russian. And so, Putin has some geopolitical challenges, and he certainly has to be careful about how he positions Russia going into the next decade. Remember, he's already been in power now for almost 20 years, and he's seen U.S. presidents come and he's seen U.S. presidents go, and he still maintains a grip on Russia. So that's it for Geopolitics. We'll be back hopefully quickly with video number 4.